Hey, so look, I want to do something slightly different today, and I'm sorry about that, but I think it's important to talk about. So, I want to talk about Keir Starmer. Please don't leave, okay? I promise you, it's going to be worth it. I think. So if you've watched any of my other videos, you've probably seen me make little jabs about Starmer and stuff, but I just have some things that I want to get off my chest. If you're anything like me, you're probably finding yourself increasingly pissed off with the direction Starmer has taken the Labour Party, and with the attitude of his blind supporters. There seems to be this argument that we just shouldn't really criticise Starmer or Labour because, hey, we don't want another term of the Tories, right? But I don't really subscribe to that. I believe Labour should be better. They should offer an alternative. And you can bet your ass I'm going to call them out if they fail to do that. Also, if you're anything like me, you're probably feeling depressingly politically homeless right about now, and kind of like you don't have anyone to vote for or anywhere to go, and that's pretty hopeless, because, well, what are we supposed to do? Well, let's try and figure that out, and before we go into it, let's take a look at how we got here.
Well, it's all soundbite and no substance. This is about taking our party back to where we belong.
Almost on a daily basis, we've had a changing system.
There are precious things in our way of life, in our environment,
Changing colours, U-turns left, right and centre.
that it's our responsibility to protect and preserve. We've changed the party to pass on to future generations. Shown we understand the value of service. Back doing what we were created to do. Country first, party second. And look, if that sounds conservative, then let me tell you, I don't care.
In the UK, the way our political system works is via something called first past the post. In its simplest form, this essentially means that it's the first party to reach a majority number of representatives that gets to form a government. And it's in part because of this that here in the UK we've developed a sort of unofficial two-party state. There are only ever two parties that really stand the chance of reaching the majority number at any given time: the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, also known as the Tories. Now, part of the problem with the idea of a two-party state, whether intentional or through circumstance, is that it inevitably leads to a them versus us outlook in politics in general. In my opinion, at least. It seems that people in a desperate bid to understand the complex processes and, let's face it, rather dull mechanisms of UK politics, they seek out the simplicity, and us versus them, two oppositional teams, is basically the simplest way to understand anything. Depending on the side you want to take, you pick your party and hold fast to that. The footballisation of politics. And when we reach this point, it doesn't actually seem to matter what your chosen party stands for, what their policies really are, or what damage they may do. What matters is that they're your team and you stick to it. The red versus blue mentality. The have-nots versus the haves. The working class versus the elites. Labour versus Tory.
What are they talking about? You know what? I f***ing hate you.
It's also very simplistic. It's a simple way of understanding things. And it's easy to see why people fall into this trap, or why it might be difficult for someone to admit that they have fallen into this trap once they come to realise it. But here's the thing. That's not really the full picture. In fact, it's total nonsense, because, look, the parties change all the time, and what they stand for change all the time. Let me explain.
The choice is in your hands, but my recommendation is clear.
The current Tory government have actually only been in power since 2019. Despite that, however, there have been 3 different people leading the party and acting as Prime Minister, and a multitude of different people filling up roles in the cabinet and thus making up the government. Their policies and approaches have also shifted with the advent of a new leader. From Boris Johnson's Brexit-focused shambles, to Liz Truss's brief tenure tanking the economy, to current head honcho, Rishi Sunak, whose main tactic seems, to me at least, to be to just hurl every culture war-shaped distraction he can find at the wall and hope that something sticks. But prior to 2019, we had a different Tory government in charge. And these are not the same party. Yes, they share certain key aspects, a name, a logo, a general sort of disdain for the lower classes, and a focus on helping big businesses over working people and social services, but they also had some relatively major differences as well. For one thing, prior to Brexit and the rise of Boris Johnson, the sort of lunatic right-wing faction of the Tory party were kept mostly in the shadows. I mean, there's a reason you'd never really heard of Jacob Rees-Mogg until all of that kicked off.
But what is happening is that the government is tackling this issue, is dealing with it as quickly as possible, and the key is we've got our fish back. They're now British fish, and they're better and happier fish for it.
Oh god, he's like a cartoon. I hate him. Of course, that faction was there, but as a predominantly centre-right party, the Tories didn't seem much to care for that particular brand of racist, bigoted, fascistic approach to politics. But Brexit changed everything. And I do mean everything.
Brexit means Brexit.
Britain's membership of the European Union was something that had long been a source of contention for many within politics, and by the 2010s, the growing popularity of fringe single-issue parties like the Nigel Farage-fronted UKIP, as well as the increasing unrest from those anti-EU members of the Conservative Party itself, meant that the then Tory leader, David Cameron, pledged to hold a referendum on EU membership should his party win another majority at the next election. They did, and thus the clusterfuck of 2016. But as is almost always the problem with these things, to try and boil down a complex series of rules, laws, standards, pledges, deals, agreements and the like into an issue as simple as leave or remain isn't really a reasonable way to make those kinds of decisions. And because of this, Brexit only seemed to sort of spur on the footballisation of politics I mentioned earlier. The two teams versus each other, the oppositions. And Boris Johnson, as one of the key members of the Leave campaign, kind of seized on that.
And on Monday, MPs will arrive at Westminster to form a new parliament. And yes, they will have an overwhelming mandate from this election to get Brexit done, and we will honour that mandate by January the 31st.
He took it and twisted the whole thing into yet another example of red v blue, Labour v Tories. And this is despite the fact that the then leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was actually not campaigning to ignore or overthrow the outcome of the Brexit referendum at all, rather to just have another vote. And if we've reached a point where voting has become undemocratic, well, I don't know what to say. But so effective is the then versus us pick your colour and support your team approach that once again it simply doesn't actually seem to matter what the policies are or what the actual current incarnation of a party themselves stands for. Now look, I've used the Tories and Brexit as an example here because it's one of the most clear-cut obvious examples in recent history. There are very clear teams, Leave versus Remain, and there are very clear examples of how the political class use those teams to sort of weave their own narrative. As absurd as it may be, we were preyed upon by certain members of the political class to further their goals. Johnson's Tories became the party of the Leavers, and everyone else was just on the side of Remain, regardless of whether or not they actually were. But it's not just the Tories that do this kind of crap, and in my opinion, there's a far more insidious and worrying example of it happening with the Labour Party right now.
Who are we in it for? Who do we serve?
So, full disclosure, I'm a lefty. I'd call myself a lefty anyway. In fact, if pushed, I'd probably go so far as to say that I was a socialist, although there are parts of that ideology that I don't fully subscribe to either. I'd consider myself to be woke. I'm staunchly anti-rich, very, very anti the police, and I'd even go so far as to say maybe sometimes I'm kind of radical. In fact, I'd say that I've got more and more radical the older I've got, so take that, you'll become more conservative as you get older, people. I'm telling you all this because I think it's important to know, and it's important to know that actually I've sort of reached a point now where my political stance is f*** it, let's just burn the whole thing to the ground and start again. And I want to be upfront and clear about all of this because, well, I really f***ing hate Keir Starmer. From 2008 to 2013, Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions and Head of the Crown Prosecution Service after working several years as a barrister. In 2015, he was elected as a Labour Party MP and was appointed as Shadow Minister for Immigration by the then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. In June of 2016, Starmer, along with several other members of the Shadow Cabinet, resigned from their positions in what many saw as a coup against the current leadership, and although Corbyn would ultimately win yet another leadership election, with 61% of the vote no less, and Starmer would accept yet another position in his shadow cabinet that same year, he never really seemed to be fully on side with the direction Corbyn was taking with the party. And I think it's worth pointing out here that the Labour Party itself actually has a rather complicated history of its position as the so-called left-leaning mainstream party. While it's easy to view the two major parties as simply being left and right, in Labour's case that's not always entirely been true. Tony Blair, leader of the Labour Party from 1994 to 2007, and Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007, famously dragged the party into the centre, turning it from a more left-leaning space into one that was often described as being a broad church, but that's actually just neoliberal bullshit. Blair's New Labour agreed not to fight the Tories on how the economy should work, and thus allowed, to a certain extent, for the rich to keep getting richer and the poor, while infamous Conservative leader Margaret Thatcher once supposedly said that New Labour was her greatest accomplishment, and while it may not be true that she actually said that, the sentiment definitely is. Starmer, meanwhile, seems to fall in line with certain sections of the Labour Party that adheres to the Blairite ideals. As such, when he won the leadership election in 2020, following Corbyn's resignation post the 2019 general election, Starmer himself has slowly, and rather grotesquely, in my opinion, been transforming Labour into a sort of Tory light party, and he's been able to do this precisely because of the footballisation trend that we've already outlined. An argument that I often see made in defence of Starmer is that, well, actually, he's just a liar. He doesn't actually mean any of the things that he says, and he's just saying those things to gain power. And, well, this always struck me as a bit of a weird argument to make, because, lying's bad. This is also very much in line with neoliberal thinking, in my opinion, where there are no good or bad actions, only good or bad teams, and the good team can do bad things because it's in the aid of the greater good. It's just bullshit. And if your only reason for voting for someone is either that you like their terrible policies or you think they're lying about their terrible policies, that's not quite the win you think it is. But putting all that aside for a moment, and assuming that maybe that is true and that Starmer does actually have everyone's best intentions at heart, let's take a look at what he's actually done, shall we? By 2022, Starmer had completely abandoned the socialist platform that he had advocated for during his campaign to become leader, and backtracked on a bunch of pledges that he had made, including nationalising public utilities, scrapping tuition fees, ending privatisation within the NHS, and upholding freedom of movement from within the EU. Great start! Starmer has also claimed that his party will stand with trade unions and that they will work shoulder to shoulder with trade unions to stand for working people, but has appeared to take a rather confusing approach to what that actually means, even going so far as to sack MP Sam Terry for standing with rail workers on the picket line and ordering his MPs not to appear alongside any striking workers. So, shoulder to shoulder, but don't touch me! There was also the initial promise to abolish universal credit, the controversial benefits system, but this then changed to simply reforming it. There was also a pledge to invest £28 billion a year in green technologies, but this has since shifted to become an eventual goal at some vague point in the future. He also reportedly had an ambitious plan for childcare that would guarantee parents access to it up until the end of primary school, but this has now also seemingly evaporated and been thrown on the scrap heap. There's a trend with Starmer's Labour, and at this point it's not so much U-turning as it is sort of Tokyo drifting, but not like in a cool way, in a sort of sad, your dad hanging around with a bunch of teenagers doing donuts in the car park out the back of the chippy sort of way. Is that too specific an example? He promised to increase tax for the top 5% of earners, but now wants to lower them. The party claimed that when it came to the ever-growing sky-high housing costs, doing nothing is not an option, but then later noted that actually they don't have any plans on that front. When it comes to the two-child benefit cap, a horrible Tory policy that's even been criticised by many on Starmer's front bench as being heinous and inhuman, the party have confirmed that they are not changing that policy. Liz Kendall, the only Labour leadership candidate in 2015 to fully back Tory government benefit cuts, is now the shadow cabinet minister in charge of benefits. Make it make f***ing sense! Jesus Christ! The leadership has also been accused of rigging elections, blocking left-wing candidates from standing, and then, of course, there are the accusations of racism within the party. Martin Ford KC, who was commissioned by Starmer to investigate allegations of bullying, racism and sexism, said that the party was enabling a hierarchy of racism, while the Labour whip was suspended from Diane Abbott, a black Labour MP, for comments she made in which she claimed that Jewish people do not experience racism, while MP Rosie Duffield has faced absolutely zero consequences for dabbling in a little Holocaust revisionism. And speaking of Duffield...
But as you will all know, there are a small number
of people who do not identify with the gender that they were born into, and it can be incredibly stressful.
To call Starmer's approach to LGBTQ plus people a clusterfuck is to put it mildly. In fact, I go so far as to say that he is personally in part responsible for the growing homophobic, transphobic and biphobic sentiment rising across the UK, and that includes violence and murder. And this is where the concept of lying to gain power really starts to crack and fall apart, because look, even if he is lying to win an election, and even if he will backtrack on absolutely everything once he enters number 10, he's still fanning the fucking flames right now, isn't he? And that matters. Rosie Duffield is perhaps one of the most obvious examples of this, alongside her brazen Holocaust revisionism, in which she liked to tweet by transphobe and weirdly proportioned so-called comedian and divorcee Graham Linehan, in which he claimed trans people were never targeted by the Nazis. And they were. Soz, that's just a fact. If you don't like it, stop siding with the f***ing Nazis. Duffield has a long history of transphobia. She has repeatedly shared her disdain for trans people and has repeatedly been criticised for calling trans women male-bodied biological men and saying that she doesn't think that they should have access to domestic violence shelters, women's prisons or single-sex toilets. Basically, she's just a bigot. A horrible, horrible, horrible bigot. Concerns have also been expressed by those within Starmer's inner circle around her supposed friendship with Queen TERF J.K. Rowling. She has been reported as saying, "I won't lie. I won't say a man is a woman, Eddie Izzard is not a woman," even going so far as to claim that she's leaving the party if Izzard stood as Labour MP and made it onto an all-woman shortlist, despite the shortlist being discontinued anyway. Several weeks later, when speaking at a conference for the anti-trans campaign group LGB Alliance, Duffield claimed that she would rather be arrested than call Izzard a woman. I'll say it again. She's a bigot. A horrible, spiteful bigot. Two of her own staff members quit due to what they called her overtly transphobic views, the first of whom was a cis lesbian and was also reportedly the only LGBTQ+ member of Duffield's team, and who wrote in her resignation letter, "Your lack of retraction of these words indicated that it was indeed your stance, which I believe to be transphobic. This put me, an LGBT+ member of your team and someone who has campaigned for LGBT+ rights most of my life, in a highly compromised position." During a debate on the Equality Act, while SNP MP Kirsty Blackman explained how one of her constituents, a trans person, had expressed fears over suicidal ideation, Duffield, along with SNP MP Joanna Cherry, were seen visibly rolling their eyes and shaking their heads dismissively. Fuck you, Duffield. Fuck you. As far as I'm aware, Starmer has never really commented on Duffield's brazen transphobia, other than in a clusterfuck of an interview with Andrew Marr, in which he said that it wasn't wrong to say that only women have a cervix. Which, to be clear, it is provably wrong, because, trans men and intersex people exist. Indeed, Starmer himself has been accused of throwing trans people under the bus. He has appeared to support outing trans youths to their parents, with seemingly no care for the danger this could put some people in, and has U-turned on self-ID. Of course, he just loves to U-turn. It's like the Starmer dance. And indulges right-wing talking points and rhetoric in interviews, including answering that oh-so-common dog whistle, "What is a woman?" by saying,
For 99.9-something% of women, it's all biological and it's very straightforward. And the Labour Party has fought for women's rights for a very, very long time, for equality of pay, equality of recognition, etc. And we will fight for women's rights going into the future. So that's, in a sense, very straightforward.
He also positions the discussion around women's rights, which plays into the notion that trans rights and women's rights are in opposition with each other, which they're not. They're the same rights. Of course, that didn't stop him from attending Pride for a photo op, but it isn't just transphobia that Starmer seems wholly uninterested in tackling. In 2021, Starmer visited Jesus House in London on Good Friday and later shared a video of his visit online. The church's senior pastor has spoken openly against same-sex marriage and equality laws. Starmer, of course, claimed that he didn't know of the church's reputation and apologised. But then the following year, 2022, he did the exact same thing with a different church. So, is it closeted homophobia? Or are you and your team just a bunch of idiots? Neither one of those are qualities that I want in a leader. In his recent cabinet reshuffle, Starmer appointed Shabana Mahmood as Shadow Justice Secretary, who herself has come under fire for homophobic attitudes, intervening when anti-gay protesters demonstrated against inclusive education in Birmingham, and who said age appropriateness and religious backgrounds needed to be considered when discussing same-sex relationships. Now, this shouldn't really have to be explained to you, but if you don't think that there's an issue with discussing heterosexual relationships with certain age groups and religious backgrounds, but you do think the same about same-sex relationships, you're a homophobic bigot. Soz. It's also worth noting that Annalise Dodds has kept her current role as Shadow Equalities Minister, a woman who has ruled out self-ID for trans people and vowed to protect single-sex spaces for biological women. So equality for all, but trans people, eh? In fact, Starmer's recent reshuffle is pretty emblematic of his entire leadership in the direction that he has crushed the Labour Party into. To quote Owen Jones, writing for The Guardian, Labour now has a shadow cabinet dominated by politicians opposed to taxing the well-to-do, sceptical about public investment, fixated with expanding the private sector in public services, and uncomfortable with the welfare state. There is no left in Starmer's Labour Party, there is no progressiveness. The right wing has fully taken hold and it's just coming at you under the mask of Labour, using the symbols and the language but twisting them into the opposite of what they should mean and stand for. We've seen this before. It's no secret that these kinds of movements don't come looking like monsters. If they did, they'd never get anywhere. Starmer's inability to oppose bigotry, to offer an alternative, his fear to stand up for progressive ideals, and his pandering to a specific kind of voter base has shifted the party far from a place in which I feel comfortable. But his supporters' willingness to allow this to happen, their adherence to the Labour brand no matter what, is also partly responsible. You can argue as much as you want that it's best to have anyone but the Tories, but when the alternative is just the Tories as well, what's the point? Who do you want chasing you, Freddie or Jason? I don't care, just fucking kill me. Starmer is of course going to win an election whenever that happens, but that's more to do with just how bad the Tories have been than it is anything that he himself has done. But what do we do in this first past the post system where you've only got the two options and both of them are equally rubbish and terrible? Who do you vote for? Or do you just not vote? What's the answer here? Well, I think it's actually surprisingly simple. It's not great, but it's surprisingly simple.
Is a really simple question. Do you believe that Britain deserves better?
I suspect you probably feel like your vote doesn't matter, but the truth is that while the first past the post system likely means that the outcome is already written, that doesn't mean that you can't still make your voice heard. Your vote does matter and your voice does matter. So here's what I intend to do. I'm not going to vote for either. Starmer's Labour is going to win. The polls tell us as much. You don't really need to worry about another term for the Tories because they're already on the way out. But you do need to worry about how much of a mandate Starmer's brand of non-progressive progressivism thinks it has. Look at the policies of all the parties and decide who you want to support. But don't vote Tory because, well, they've destroyed the country, and don't vote Labour because they've been infected and are on a slippery slope into the right wing. Labour offer no hope for a country broken and beaten by years of Tory austerity and hate, and although whatever we do they'll likely still make it into office, we can still send them a message by not making that majority and overwhelming them. Show them with your vote that you're not going to just blindly support Labour no matter what, that it isn't about the brand, but rather about the policies and the ideals that it's built upon. You see, that's not how this is supposed to work. You're not supposed to have a team that you blindly support. You're supposed to have an internal set of morals, and then you look at all of the parties, all of the candidates, all of the potential MPs, what they're offering and their policies, and then decide on that which one best aligns with you and your ideals. Starmer may very well win an election whenever that happens, but we can still show him that we reject his wet wipe, whiny, right-wing stained, bigoted, racist, transphobic piece of shit party and the policies that they stand for. Thanks. Hey so sorry about this one. Next vid will definitely be back to the horror, or at least back to horror movies. Don't worry. In fact, I'm quite excited about what it's going to be, and if you'd like to help me put together the script for the next vid and for any upcoming vids, you can do so by supporting me over on Patreon, where you'll also get your name in the credits and have access to some writings and stuff. I'm thinking of starting a sort of watch-along thing over there too if I do get any followers, so that would be cool. Anyway, if that's not your bag, please like, share and subscribe, that also really helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching, see you soon,